Her name is Sagwas, Ellen Gabriel. Turtle Clan, Ghanaian Giga Nation. Ellen was chosen by the people of the Longhouse and her community of Kanesatake to be their spokesperson during the 1990 siege of Kanesatake, the 1990 Oka crisis, to protect the pines from the expansion of a 9-hole golf course and luxury condominiums development in the Kanesatake. For the past 25 years, she has worked diligently as a human rights and environmental advocate for the collective and individual rights of Indigenous peoples, and has worked diligently to sensitize the public on the history, culture, and identity of Indigenous peoples. Ellen is the former president of the Quebec Native Women's Association. She currently is a cultural consultant for the Kanesatake Ungwawa Neongwa Riota. She remains a vigilant advocate for gender equity, justice for murdered and missing Indigenous women, the revitalization of Indigenous languages, culture, traditions, and Indigenous peoples' rights to self-determination. Please welcome Sagwas, Ellen Gabriel.
So I am very pleased and honored to be here. I first wanted to greet you in my language, and it's an ancient language. We don't know how old it is. And it's a language that is one of the threatened languages in Canada that might not be spoken at the end of this century. When I first realized that I was coming here, I thought this is going to be a great opportunity to speak to some wonderful people, because in the almost 26 years that I've been doing this, I have met such marvelous and interesting people. And to be on Treaty 1 territory is a great honor. And to be asked to speak at this marvelous event that talks about Indigenous women, that talks about women's rights, is a great honor for me. I know that you worked hard to put this together, so I just want to raise my arms and lift you up in our custom, because it's not easy to do something like this in a world that, no matter where you go, women's security is an issue. So it's a great pleasure and honor that I'm here with you today. When I spoke with Anita Neville about this event, Anita and I go way back when she was an MP, and she was very supportive of Indigenous women's issues. And she gave me a sense that there was a genuineness about her support of the work that we were doing. And she was one of the first MPs to support when we started talking about murdered and missing Indigenous women in 2004 and onwards. And people were saying, oh, it's not an issue, that's a domestic issue. So I'm quite pleased and honored to have been asked by Anita to be here today, so thank you. I know that you are also celebrating here in Manitoba 100 years of the women's vote. It's incredible, and I know that men were also standing side by side women 100 years ago in trying to get women the right to vote in the decision making. As Indigenous women, we face double discrimination within this society because of colonial racism, institutionalized racism, gender discrimination that has existed since Canada's inception and since Europeans arrived on our shores. Indigenous women were very tough and bold, and we were part of the decision-making process. In Iroquois culture, and there are 6 nations within the Iroquois Confederacy, women are title holders to the land. Women are mediators. Women are part of the justice system. They are part of the culture. They pass on the language. They pass on the clans. And today we still have that. But we have also been impacted by colonialism. We have been impacted by the Indian Act. And we do have men who say the rhetoric of how important women are, and yet they beat their wives. And so this is why it's really important to continue talking about this. It's really important for men, and I'm so pleased to see the amount of men that are here today. Because everyone has a mother. Everyone has an auntie or a sister or a cousin. Everyone is born from a woman. In Iroquois culture, the first two human beings on this planet, on this beautiful Mother Earth that we call home, were women. Otitsagayu, the ancient flower, she was the first one to come down from Sky World, where they didn't have any needs. Everything was taken care of for them by the tree of life. The tree that brought down, that had a little hole in it, and she could see that somewhere down below there was a planet full of water. And she went down, and she was so curious, as we women are. We're very curious, we're very stubborn. We're also very loyal. And we have that part of her in our DNA. And she was pregnant. And there are like over 120 different versions of the creation story of the Iroquois people, because everybody likes to tell a story. But the essence of it is that the first two human beings were women. And she gave birth to a baby girl. And that is why in the Confederacy, when the Ganahuida was going around trying to bring peace to the people that were at war, the first human being that accepted Kayanarakoa in her own self-determination was Jamusaze. She was a woman. And Jamusaze was feeding the warriors as they were going by because the people were warring. And the Ganahuida said, you know, you should stop feeding the warriors because you're encouraging them to go to war. And she says, hunger does not bring peace. And so they sat for a while, and she was the first person to give that acceptance of the great law of peace. And the great law of peace is really about your own self-determination first, and then the self-determination, respect, honor, courage, love. Respect is really something quite embedded in our languages, in our culture, in our customs. It's an integral part of our sovereignty, and we've forgotten about that. We're so busy running after the colonial powers that be and those who follow colonialism that we want to bring them down instead of lifting them up, or saying, I disagree with you, but I still love you and I still respect you and I still care for you. We've forgotten that because of colonialism has taken that power away from us as human beings. They've taken that from us. They tried to strip us of our humanity by putting our children into Indian residential school systems, where they were beaten, where they were physically abused and sexually abused and mentally abused and spiritually abused. And that is the history of Canada. So when you are celebrating the history of Canada next year, the 150th anniversary of Canada, remember where that comes from. Remember what this is founded on. A genocide of kidnapping an identifiable group of people with a land base, with a language, with a culture, with a custom, with a governance, who greeted your ancestors. And we're continuing to greet new people to our Turtle Island who know nothing about us. And when we talk about reconciliation, we need to start talking about and addressing the issues of the gender discrimination, the rupture of the family unit that has been placed against Indigenous women, has been on our shoulders. We need to start talking about that amongst ourselves as Indigenous people. Uguahua people, the real human being, that's what Uguahua people means. And so, I've been watching, I'm not very good at social media, but I try my best. And sometimes it's too overwhelming. And sometimes I just want to shut it off. But recently, you know, I want to really emphasize this, and just to show you how strong the racism is in Canada, that CBC had to take off its commentary on any issues it dealt with, news stories that had to do with Indigenous peoples. We are in 2016. We have had the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, which volumes of work that talk about what happened against Indigenous people and women in particular. We just recently, last year, had a call to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which took years to get going, which heard and witnessed countless testimonials of survivors of Indian residential schools. And this is not counting the ones who passed away so far. And it's not even considering the number of children who died in the care of those who were supposed to protect them and teach them. No, we are still talking about economic security. We are talking about energy security. We're still talking about the things that happened. You know, we have not evolved as a species. We have so much to learn from those teachings of our ancestors. They had a science that evolved. They had a science that was growing. And it is estimated that after the first century of contact, 3/4 of the Indigenous populations in the Americas died from war or disease. So we lost 3/4 of traditional knowledge holders. We lost those languages. And earlier I talked to you about those languages that are threatened. You know, UNESCO has stated that Indigenous languages are most threatened in Canada, one of the most richest and most developed countries in the world. And in Canada, Indigenous languages are #1 threatened. Because assimilation keeps going. Colonialism is not a thing of the past. It's going on as we are in this room today. And it's not going to stop unless you, as the Canadian constituents of the politicians that you elect, decide to make this part of your curriculum, decide that you're going to make changes, that you're going to respect our rights of self-determination. And that right to self-determination is what? This is what we keep talking about. It's not what the Assembly of First Nations wants. With all due respect to them. That's a colonial structure. We need to go back to those structures where gender equity is involved in the decision-making processes, where gender equity is involved in every single part of the decisions that are made, whether it's resource development, whether it's education, whether it's health, whether it's social services. Whatever it is, women must be part of those decisions at the end of the day. In free, prior, and informed consent, women need to be equally involved. Full and effective participation. Chelsea Vowell stated in her blog in April, and Canada must move heaven and earth to ensure this violence ends. And whatever you think that might cost, it will always be less expensive than a failure to act. And she hit the nail on the nose with that. She hit the nail on the nose because that's continuing to go on. There are more children in foster care in the child welfare system than ever went to residential school. And where do we see our future leaders? They're our children. And if we're not teaching them the real history of Canada, if we're not teaching them their own history, their own part of who they are on this planet, what their ancestors lived through, then we are failing them. And we will continue to fail them. Recently, Quebec came out with its curriculum that is going to come out in the fall. And their part on Indigenous education was that Indian residential school negatively impacted Indigenous languages. Point final. What on earth is that? I have sat with many ministers in Quebec to talk about changing the curriculum. in, and that our Indigenous academics, we have such brilliant people in academia, that they are capable of creating the curriculum that needs to be in Canadian schools. The former Auditor General, Sheila Fraser, said that it would take 28 years for on-reserve schools or in-community schools to catch up with the level and quality of education that is found in the rest of the Canadian school system. This is 2016. We have not progressed. We have not progressed because there are people like the Stephen Harpers of this world who think that Indigenous people should be assimilated, who agree with Duncan Campbell Scott and Sir John A. Macdonald that we are a problem to be fixed. Reserves were created to protect the settlers who were coming here, to keep us away from the people who are coming from the old country. That's what we call it. It's the old country. And in 1995, a group of people got together in my community because we were sick and tired of hearing about warriors and masked men and guns and being criminalized for tobacco. And we did a research project. In 1995, our history book came out, and it's called At the Wood's Edge. We sent out a press release to all those journalists, and believe you me, we had every single kind of journalist you'd want to think of during the crisis, or the siege, or the resistance. Not a single one showed up. Not one showed up for our history book. And in it they found some wonderful quotes from our ancestors, from the days before Europeans arrived on our shores. And they said lasting peace cannot be achieved only through military or political means, but through a higher level of consciousness and understanding. There can be no lasting peace while fear or anger exists between people. And that is exactly what is existing between our people right now. Fear, like Stephen Harper says, that we're going to veto resource development. Anger that we're a burden on Canadian taxpayers. Anger that we get everything for free. If that were the case, if we had such benefits coming from the Indian Act, then we should be the most richest people in this country, not the most poor. When I consider what is going on in the rest of the world and how rape is used as a weapon of war, and in June 1st of 1996, the UN finally came up with something, that it was a crime against humanity to use rape as a weapon of war. 1996, that's not that long ago. Most of you here were born, except maybe some of those little ones that I saw running around. But it's still being used. It's as old as the human species. And when we talk about women's security, we forget about them as human beings. We forget about the science that was involved in bringing things together, like corned beans and squash. That was one of the things that came from Sky Woman's daughter's body when she died. It was a gift. And our people knew that when in times of poverty, that we could rely on those three sisters, Junhekwa, the sustainers of life, corn, beans, and squash, to keep us going through those times, those seasons where we didn't have much food. And in recent times, nutritionists finally discovered that when you put those three together, they can make a complete protein. So we have some wonderful gifts. And when you start celebrating Canada 150, take a look on the screen. And this is just a tiny fraction of the gift that Indigenous peoples have given to the world. To the world. Not just Canada, but to the world. And it's amazing. It always astounds me to see the kinds of things that we have contributed to the world. In our land, of course, you know, the reason why there's such resistance against either putting the curriculum, the real history of Canada's history in the curriculum, and the reason why there's a little bit of hesitation, and why Canada's, under the Harper government, didn't support, even though they were on the Human Rights Council at the time, that they did not support the UN Declaration is because of economics. It really ignores human rights, it really ignores the cultural rights, it ignores Canada's colonial history. In fact, Stephen Harper, in his little bubble, announced to the world that Canada has no colonial history. So I don't know what school and what quality of education he got, but you can be sure that there are others that agree like what he has said. And that is the sad part of that. So one of the things that we need to address is the issue of land dispossession. That is probably the #1 cause of Indigenous poverty in Canada. The #1 cause. There is a wonderful exercise by the group Kairos, which is a group of ecumenical. How many of you people know Kairos? There's a wonderful exercise that they do that's called the blanket exercise, and it talks about here's the Americas before contact, and here's the Americas now. And you're standing on blankets, and it gets shorter, and I'm not doing justice to it, but I recommend that you all experience the blanket exercise. We did this with teachers, and the teachers were crying. Elementary school teachers, they were crying because they said, why was I not taught this in school? I am a teacher. I should know this. But it's not just teachers that should know this. You should know this. There's such a history, and it's good and it's bad, but that's life. It's like relationships. This is what it is. We're in this relationship for the good or the worse. If we don't respect each other, we're not going to make changes. If we don't respect each other's differences, there's not going to be changes. And that goes for us as well, eh, Winnipeg people, Indigenous people, that goes for us too. It's not just the settlers we're talking about now. Reconciliation starts with us too. But I want to emphasize the reason why there's so much land dispossession. And that's because Canada bases its sovereignty on 3 legal fictions, which the UN has denounced, which is in many, not just the UN Declaration, but in international human rights instruments, and they're doctrines of superiority. They're morally reprehensible, says the UN Declaration. The United Nations has said that. They're scientifically false, terra nullius, that there was no people here when the Europeans first came. Doctrine of conquer, we were not conquered. We were allies. We fought with your people in the War of 1812. We were not conquered. But after the War of 1812, our people were so depleted. They were tired of the fight. We lost so many. It was so easy for Canada and Britain to put us on reserves. So easy, too easy. And that's where our homes are. And that's where we feel safe, regardless of the domestic violence and the lateral violence. At least for me, I'll speak for myself. That's where I feel safe. That's my home, where generations after generations have walked before me. I come from a very small community in Ganestage, and it's 62 kilometers northwest of Montreal. And we have been fighting colonialism and imperialism since 1721, when the Sulpician priests brought Christian Mohawks, Nipissings, Algonquins, and Delawares to a community in the dead of winter because they knew a community already existed. The pottery shards found in Oka National Park are dated 7,000 BC. They're Iroquoian, they're not Algonquin. And today, we have lost more land. I'm not sure how much we've paid in lawyer's fee, but the amount of land that we had before 1990 has even diminished further. Because Canada only recognizes band councils. They made it illegal in 1924 for the Iroquois Confederacy to be a legitimate form of governance. They exist today. We exist today. The people of the Longhouse. And I know that there are longhouses right across Canada. And in those longhouses is where everything goes, where the women are making decisions with the men, where the women are still passing on those kinds of teachings to the young ones. Canada is legally bound to uphold the purposes and principles of the Charter of the United Nations. And this includes promoting and encouraging respect for human rights and for fundamental freedoms for all without distinction. We still have the Indian Act.